And instead, let's think about Hebrews. Because that's what we've been talking about on Wednesday nights, right? We've been going through the book of Hebrews. And we have been seeing, well, tell me some things that we've been talking about in Hebrews. Luke.
We learned about how angels, how like God's greater than angels.
Yeah? Zach?
We were learning about how Jesus was better than like everything.
Had?
Like Jesus was better than Melchizedek.
Yeah?
Jesus was better than the priests.
So Jesus is like better than better.
Jesus is basically the best. Yeah, that phrase has come up a lot. Jesus is better than blank. And we filled in that blank with a lot of different things. Angels, Melchizedek, priests, Moses, the law, all sorts of stuff. And so a lot of the stuff that we've looked at, even though we're going through the book of Hebrews, which is in the New Testament, a lot of the stuff we talked about was originally in the Old Testament. And we're going to be starting in Hebrews chapter 11 this week, and that trend is going to continue. So we're going to keep talking about a lot of Old Testament stuff. And we're starting something kind of different. As you can see, Jaron is not teaching tonight. So we're going to start a little sort of mini-series within Hebrews about...
What was the question?
There's no question.
We had two truths and a lie. Well, the question was, which was the lie?
That's the one.
Anyway, so we're starting a new little mini-series. And so each of our Crosswalk staff, middle school and high school, are going to come in and talk about a different character in Hebrews 11. Because Hebrews 11 goes through and it talks about a bunch of different people from the Old Testament. And so our new series that we're starting is going to be looking at one of those people each night. And so we are starting that tonight. I'm going to start talking about the first person. But first, we need to look at the first 3 verses of Hebrews chapter 11 to see what this chapter is going to be about.
Can I read?
Sure.
Okay.
But not yet. So at the very end of chapter 10, the author of Hebrews brings up the topic of faith. He says that faith preserves our souls, or like saves our souls. Faith is what saves us. And so he's going to take this concept of faith that he just brought up, and he's going to talk about that for all of chapter 11. And first he's going to give us a definition of faith, and that is in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. So Micah, do you want to read the first verse of chapter 11 for us?
Now faith is assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
Nice. So there is our definition of of faith from the author of Hebrews. So that's kind of what he's building off. He says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. So I'm going to keep reading the next couple verses. So in verse 2 it says, for by it the people of old received their commendation. Do any of you guys know what commendation means?
No.
No? Had?
It means like some place to stay or something.
Accommodation.
Oh.
Heard the word before.
Good.
So, me or not?
Lizzie.
Okay. It's like something that's common that you're like giving to somebody else. Commendation.
Not quite.
Isn't it like what you're known for, kind of? My version says commended. So.
Yeah, so commendation. So when after this lesson, you guys come up to me and you say, Jeremiah, that was the best lesson we've ever heard. Thank you so much for teaching. That was incredible. That, I would be receiving commendation. So it's like praise, applause kind of thing. It's like, so it's saying that when the people of old, it says, like the people of the Old Testament, when they had faith, they were doing a good job. And so they received commendation. So that's basically what that word means. Then verse 3 says, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. So he gives us like a little example of what faith kind of looks like. And that's, we believe, we have faith that God created everything in the universe and he created it out of nothing. Like there wasn't anything there before. He spoke, and it all came into being. So that's an example of something that we have faith in. And so when we look at these verses, there's a lot of, like verse 1 says, hope for and things not seen. And then verse 3 says things that aren't visible. So there's a lot of this language that's kind of like invisible or unseen, and it all just sounds like kind of vague. And I think, like for me, I think that's how I think about faith a lot of times. I don't know if that's true for you guys, but it seems like if I say, if somebody says, have faith that it'll all work out, or have faith in yourself, it's kind of just like hope for the best almost. And it's just this kind of like, maybe this good thing will happen, maybe it won't. But even though we can kind of get that impression from some of the words that it uses, it also uses words like in verse 1, assurance or conviction. Like if you're sure of something, that means like it's true. Conviction, think if we use that word for sin in our lives. Like if you're convicted of a sin, that means that there's a sin in your life and you need to change it. So that's another example of knowing something. So those words, assurance and conviction, like those are solid words, a lot more solid than invisible and hoped for and that kind of thing. And so even though faith is kind of hard to understand and kind of hard to know exactly what it means, he's letting us know that there's some very real and concrete things about faith. And that's kind of what we see throughout the whole rest of chapter 11. As we look at all these different people that the author will bring up from the Old Testament, he's going to show us a bunch of different ways how faith made a very real difference in the world, even though sometimes what it's based in we can't really see, and maybe it hasn't even happened yet. But we'll kind of see what that actually looks like as we go further into the chapter and as we go further into the series. But I like how verse 3 kind of gives us an illustration. It talks about how God made everything out of nothing. So there was nothing there, but then he made real things that we can touch and taste and see and smell and hear. I think I got all the senses. But he made like real stuff that we can experience. And so just like God made all this stuff out of nothing, we'll see how faith, even though sometimes it's hard to see, it makes real results in the world. And so there's our little intro of Hebrews. He gives us a definition of faith, or Hebrews 11, but throughout the chapter, he's going to continue to provide examples of what faith is and what it does, how it makes a difference. And so the first person we're going to look at, the person that I'm going to talk about in our little series, is in the very next verse. It's in verse 4. So, Micah, do you want to read verse 4?
Yeah.
All right.
By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So these two names came up in that verse. There was Abel and there was Cain. And maybe you've heard these names before, especially if you grew up in the church going to Sunday school. So we're going to look back to where these names come from in the Old Testament, where the story is from. And it's back in Genesis chapter 4. So you can turn back to Genesis chapter 4. And while we're doing that and getting ready to look at the story, I'm going to show you guys a little video, a video of this story that we're about to look at. Because I don't know if this has ever happened to you guys, but sometimes if there's like a book and then they make a movie about the book, even though you're supposed to read the book first and then watch the movie, I kind of like watching the movie first and then reading the book. Because if I read the book first, then I like imagine what everybody looks like and the places look like and everything, and then I watch the movie, I'm like, what the heck? This isn't right at all.
They leave out so many good details.
Yeah, so but we're going to look at the movie first, okay? And chances are you might even recognize a few people in here.
Oh, I called it.
Now you what? I can't.
Hi, I'm Abel. And I'm Cain. And we are going to go grab some sacrifices for God. use a rock sacrifice today? No! You know what God says? We gotta have animal sacrifices. But I gotta grow on these rocks forever. No! Like, this one's perfect for harvesting. I mean, really.
They don't taste any better than that, man. It's a good year.
I want to go grab my animal, okay?
Okay, I'll be go getting some wheat. Whatever.
Here, Joshy. Here, Joshy. Good boy. You ready to get slaughtered? Come on, Joshy. Come on.
There, where we
Come on! There you go. That's a good boy. Hold on, tree. No, hey, stop. You're gonna give him blemishes. You can't have blemishes.
That's your backside if he finds out you kill his best sheep.
No, that's what we're supposed to do. Cain, we're supposed to kill. Joshy, come here. 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 Joshy! Oh my God! Joshy! Come here, Joshy! Joshy, come here!
There, we'll get some more wheat.
No, not wheat. Get
Right?
Get the no!
Black right.
Get the other sheep.
And green. How am I gonna kill Abel? He's just so much better at me than offering sacrifices. I mean, my rock farm's doing really well, but he's always got his dang sheep. Wait. I'm gonna lure him into a trap, and then I'm gonna kill him. I'm gonna scoop him to death.
Good job, Tan, my boy.
Thanks.
The Lord is very proud of you with your sacrifices, and He will bless you for all your days. You're such a great son. No one will ever top you.
Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad. It means a lot.
Hey Abel, one of your sheep got his foot caught on a rock.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh, you gotta go save him.
Yeah. So he's this way.
Over here?
Yeah, he's like this way.
Where is
So, anyways, as I was saying, Abel.
What?
Abel.
Got him!
Cain, where is your brother?
I don't have a brother.
Yes, you do.
Abel.
What have you done?
He was better than me.
From now on, whenever you scoop, you will be scooped upon tenfold.
No!
Okay. So, that is not the most accurate depiction of the story of Cain and Abel. But now you have a picture of, what the characters look like, what it looked like where they were, even if it's not. Anyway, let's look at the actual story in the Bible in Genesis chapter 4. So I'm going to read through and we're going to look at this story again, okay? So starting in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 4, now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where's Abel your brother? He said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And we'll start reading there. But then Cain goes on to complain about his curse. He's like, it's too harsh. All I did was, kill my own brother. It's the first murder in the history of mankind. But, yeah, that was the first murder.
So he's like, not as a good world record, but he has a world record for being the first murderer.
Right. So, yeah, you picked up on an important point. Cain is the bad example, and Abel's the good example. And that's the point that Hebrews 11 was trying to make when it was talking about Cain and Abel. That Abel is the good example that we're supposed to follow. And so if Abel's the good example, then we have to look at the story and we got to figure out why he was the good example. Like, what did he do that was better than what Cain did? And we see that God even thought that, Abel was the good example. It says that when Abel and Cain, they brought their sacrifices, God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but he didn't accept Cain's sacrifice. And so let's look at what they did. It said that Abel was the keeper of sheep, and then Cain worked the ground. So, Abel was in charge of the animals, and then Cain was growing the crops. So when the time came for them to bring their offerings, since Abel did sheep, he brought sheep, and since Cain did like vegetables or something, he brought some vegetables. And then God said, Abel, I like your sacrifice. Cain, I don't like your sacrifice. And that ticked Cain off so much that he ended up killing his brother. And so we got to figure out why Abel's sacrifice was good and why Cain's sacrifice was bad. And like when I'm thinking about this, my mind always goes to like food. Even though that's not what this was, like they weren't bringing God a meal, that's always where my mind goes. And so I'm like, well, of course he'd pick the meat. Like meat's so much tastier than vegetables, right?
No, carrots.
I said the fruit of the ground.
None of the ground means anything that grows out of it.
That's true.
So it means like apple trees.
Apple trees, corn,
Potato.
grain. So yeah, anything that grows out of the ground. And there's a lot of conflict on this issue, obviously. But the point is like the reason that God liked his sacrifice wasn't because God likes meat and he likes the taste of meat better, and maybe he's like had it and he likes vegetables better. I don't know. But that's not why, even though my mind usually goes there first, that's not why God liked this sacrifice better. But also, it wasn't really about, animals or vegetables or fruit or whatever at all. Because if we look at, like this was right after Adam and Eve and creation, and then Adam and Eve sinned, and this is like the next story in the Bible. And so the law that we've learned about, that Hebrews has talked about, that hasn't even happened yet. So God hasn't given his people the law of this is the kinds of sacrifices I want, and this is how I want you to do the sacrifices. And he hasn't given all those rules yet. And so this story isn't in the context of that. And even if it was, when in like the book of Leviticus, when God is giving the rules of the kinds of sacrifices, he says that some sacrifices need to be animals, but he also says that some sacrifices need to be the fruit of the ground. And there's like a grain offering. And so that's not what was going on. Even though the first thing we think of when we think of sacrifice is usually like a lamb or something, it wasn't acceptable just because, Abel's was a lamb and Cain's was bad just because it was fruit or vegetables or whatever. And so the reason that, this... You have a question?
Is that how they kept lambs from overpopulating?
I don't think that was what they were concerned about.
I know, but they always did a lamb.
And pigeons.
Wait, what?
Yeah, once God brought the law, and there was other things that were sacrificed besides just lambs, like bulls, there's pigeons. But yeah, it wasn't just lambs. But anyway, actually, Hebrews 11, where we were earlier, it actually tells us why Abel's sacrifice was better. And it was the first two words. I know you guys aren't there anymore, but it was the first two words of that verse. And it said, by faith. It said that by faith Abel offered a more acceptable sacrifice. And so, even though it was, about his faith that made it acceptable, there was a difference in their two sacrifices. And even though it's not like said straight out in the verses, it kind of implies. So let's read in Genesis chapter 4. We'll start in verse 3, and we'll read verse 3 and 4 again. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. So there's a contrast between the kinds of offerings that these brothers brought. Because it says that Abel brought the firstborn and the fat portions. And so that basically means it was the best. Like the firstborn, that was the oldest, that was the strongest. It was the one you could rely on to stay alive. That was like the most likely one to survive. But that's what Cain brought. But it just says that was what Abel brought. But Cain, it doesn't say anything like that. It just says he brought an offering. And so, my mind's going back to food again, but I want to show you guys a picture. This is called the Meat Daddy. So back in November, Jaron and I went to St. Louis for a youth ministry conference. And while we were there, somebody came up to us and they were like, you have to go try this restaurant. It's just a few blocks away. It has really good barbecue. I think it was called Sweet Fire. But so we went down, and there was this huge line, but we stayed in line because it was supposed to be really good. And we got up to where they have the menu, and we were looking at the menu, and we saw that there was this menu item called the Meat Daddy, and it was like $25 or $30 or something like that for just one of these. And it's hard to tell how much meat is actually on here, but it was a lot of meat. There's 5 different kinds, 2 sides of drink. It was huge, and it was also the best meat I've ever tasted. It was so good. Honestly, I literally think about this once a week, and I'm like, that was so good. I want that so bad. Yes, Luke?
Does the macaroni and cheese have meat in it?
No, just cheese. But it was good. The green chili wasn't the best, but everything else made up for it. But anyway, this is the best barbecue I've had. It was so good. There was a bunch of different barbecue sauce options. It was so good. And so when it says that Abel brought, the firstborn and the fat offerings, the best that he had, this is what I think of, the best meat that he had available. And then when Cain, it says that Cain brought just an offering of the fruits of the ground, I think of like steamed vegetables or something. I don't know if any of you guys like steamed vegetables, but I think they're nasty. I don't know. Vegetables is kind of just, mediocre already. But then if you steam them, it just takes what is okay and makes it soggy. That's the opposite of what you're supposed to do if you want to make something better. Nothing gets better if you make it soggy.
Steamed broccoli.
So maybe you like steamed broccoli or whatever, but if that's the case, just think of some vegetable you really don't like. I don't know, Brussels sprouts or something. But so the time for giving sacrifices was coming, and so Abel's like, oh, I'm gonna get the firstborn, the best sheep that I have, and I'm gonna offer it. And then Cain's he makes this nice salad for himself, and then he's like, oh wait, I'm supposed to give something to God, so he just grabs some broccoli and carrots and cauliflower, steams it, and then it's here, God. And so Cain was not giving his best. And so even though that's true, again, the actual sacrifice wasn't really what made the big difference. What made the big difference is what Hebrews 11 tells us, that Abel gave his sacrifice by faith. But we see Abel's faith in the sacrifice, because the reason that Abel gave such a good sacrifice is because he had faith in God. He believed that God deserved the best that he had. He also believed that God would reward him for giving the best that he had. And God did, because it says that God accepted him and his sacrifice. And over in Hebrews 11, it says, it uses that word commended again. Abel was commended as righteous, and that God commended him by accepting his gifts. And so this verse 4, this story of Cain and Abel, or mostly Abel, is the first example that the author of Hebrews uses to show us, to give us kind of a picture of faith. And that's what happens throughout all of Hebrews chapter 11. But this first one shows us a couple things, and even though, well, like I said, that this was before the law, right? And so when Abel gave this sacrifice, why was he given it? It wasn't because God had told him to do it yet, right? It wasn't because he just, he knew he was supposed to, and like, I guess I have to do this, and this is the law, or mom and dad want me to do this, or whatever. This was purely because of his faith in God. And Cain, I think if Cain had his choice, he wouldn't have given anything, because it seems like he wasn't the best dude. He had a pretty bad attitude, and the only reason he's really offering a sacrifice is because he wanted to look good, or something like that. He wanted to be better than Abel. When Abel was better than him, that really made him mad. So he didn't have the best character, and he wasn't focused on God. But Abel was obviously focused on God because he gave the best that he had. And even though this was before the law, this was even before Jesus, Abel's looking forward, and he's thinking, I know that God deserves this. He deserves the best lamb that I have. I know he deserves that because he is God. And I know that God is, he cares about me. He's a personal God. And that when he sees what we do, that he commends us for it, right? That's the word that Hebrews 11 says. And so God loves to see his people have faith in him. And he loves to see the actions, the meat daddies, if you will, that come out of someone who has faith. And so that's the first example we have, and we're going to look at a bunch more over the next weeks of as each of the different staff come in and they share a different story. And I really like this story of Cain and Abel and how Hebrews uses it, because when I read that story, I don't really think of it as a great story of faith. I don't think of Abel doing something big. It seems like kind of a normal thing that we read about Israelites doing all the time. But I like how Hebrews starts with this. I like how almost the whole Bible starts with this, like it's only in the 4th chapter. And it shows us just like a real practical way that faith was worked out in somebody's life. It was worked out through Abel giving the best sacrifice that he had, and because of that, God accepted him. And so I think that as we hear more stories and about more people, the concept of faith will become clear, because that's the reason that there's so many stories is the author will show us exactly what faith is and what it does and why it matters by showing us stories. And I think that's a really cool way to make a point, to teach something, is by doing it through stories. So I'm very excited for this series. Luke, do you have something?
So we're still in the book of Hebrews?
Yeah, so chapter 11 just talks about a bunch of different people. So this one said, by faith Abel did this. And so there's ones that say, like, by faith Abraham did this, by faith Moses did this. And so we're going to be talking about a different person each night as we go through this chapter. So stay tuned. I'm excited. I hope you guys are excited. And that's all I have for you. Let's pray, and we'll get out of here. Lord, thank you so much for this night and for letting us come here. Thank you that the snow didn't keep us away. And thank you for the book of Hebrews, that we've been able to learn from it so far through the series. And thank you for Hebrews chapter 11, where we can look at people that you commended, people that you look at and say, they did a good job. And help us to understand what faith is as we go through this series and look at different people and what they did. And help us to know what faith is, but also to aspire to have faith, to want to do things by faith, so that they are acceptable to you. And I just pray that you bless the rest of this night, bless the rest of this series, and just thank you for your word and for teaching us through it. In Jesus' name, amen.